Welcome, everybody. My name is Mina Jane. I'm the director of the Ashland Public Library in Massachusetts, and I'm excited to be here with Shannon McKenna Schmidt, who offered to do this program with us on her book, You Can't Catch Us, about Lady Bird Johnson's March into Dixie, as you can see. I was so fascinated by this topic, and when Shannon said that she would do this, I was thrilled. So we're going to get to her in just a second. I'm going to say thanks to the Friends of the Ashland Public Library for supporting all of our programs, because we couldn't do this fun stuff without them. And I'd like to thank Shannon for letting us share this program with other libraries. We were just counting, it was like 25 libraries jumped onto this program because so many people in our communities love history and true stories and, women's history, especially, I think, in this crowd. So you can buy signed books by Shannon from our favorite indie bookstore, Aesop's Fable. I'll put a link to that in the recap email I send out to everybody. And if you have questions for her, please put them in the Q&A, which is a button at the bottom of your screen. During her slides, I will turn the chat off so that you're not being distracted. I'll turn it back on so when we finish up, so you can chat with each other about all the awesome things that we're going to learn tonight. So Shannon, welcome. I'm so glad you're here. I was talking to Shannon before about how she has this wide range of books. She has, of course, You Can't Catch Us, Lady Bird Johnson's Trailblazing 1964 campaign train, and The Women Who Rode with Her, which is what we're talking about tonight. But she also wrote about Eleanor Roosevelt. But then she also wrote Novel Destinations, a travel guide to literary landmarks, from Jane Austen's Bath to Ernest Hemingway's Key West. And I was like, is there nothing you can't write about? It's so amazing. So thanks for being here, Shannon, for this one.
Well, thanks for having me. And it's funny, I'll just say briefly before we start about those other books. So I did write Novel Destinations, a travel guide to literary landmarks, author houses, and the like. Another book called Writers Between the Covers, about classic writers' love lives and how it relates to their work. And then I went about 8 years without a new book idea because it has to be new. You have to have the research materials to support it. And then I came across the story of Eleanor Roosevelt's trip to the South Pacific during World War II. And that became my third book, The First Lady of World War II. And that then led me to, after I wrote that book, I was curious to find out what other momentous journeys First Ladies might have taken. And that led me to Lady Bird Johnson, who was whistle stopping down the tracks in October 1964, and that became You Can't Catch Us.
I can't wait to hear all about this. So I'm going to go off screen and I'll be back
Okay,
after your slides.
great. Well, thanks so much to everyone for joining us tonight to hear the story of You Can't Catch Us. At the story's heart is Lady Bird Johnson, who undertook a bold, strategically brilliant, women-led campaign effort defying the conventions of her day and making history. So tonight, we're journeying back to October 1964, when President Lyndon Johnson was in a race against the Republican candidate Barry Goldwater. LBJ set an ambitious goal for himself to win the election with a landslide victory, proving that he earned the presidency and that he hadn't just inherited it after John F. Kennedy's assassination. He felt he owed it to the American public to state his case and to win their approval on his own. And in this election, the dominant domestic issue was civil rights and race relations. 3 months earlier, LBJ signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which hastened the end of the Jim Crow laws that legalized racial segregation. The legislation was widely unpopular in the South, particularly since a Southern president threw his political weight behind it. LBJ, who hailed from Texas, was called a traitor to the South, and hostility toward him ran very high. Alabama governor and notorious segregationist George Wallace called the Civil Rights Act the most monstrous piece of legislation ever enacted by the United States Congress. Barry Goldwater fanned the flames of animosity with a campaign strategy that courted the racist vote. Martin Luther King Jr. said on the day Goldwater accepted the Republican nomination for president, while not himself a racist, Mr. Goldwater articulates a philosophy which gives aid and comfort to the racists. The fact is that LBJ didn't need the South to win the election. Polls had him leading by significant margins over Goldwater, and it was widely predicted that he would win. And some of the president's advisors were against allocating campaign resources in the South, arguing that they didn't need it and it was a lost cause, so why make the effort? But neither Lady Bird nor the president were willing to simply dismiss the South. Lady Bird, a Texan with Alabama roots, was proud of her Southern heritage and of what her husband had done to advance civil rights. At the 1964 Democratic National Convention in late August, after LBJ formally accepted the nomination, a reporter predicted, "The country is about to see a campaigning First Lady, the likes of which it has never seen before." And Lady Bird delivered. She took inspiration from her role model, the trailblazing Eleanor Roosevelt, and she fearlessly broke new ground. She did something that no other First Lady had done, take a leading role on the campaign trail. And Lady Bird had been actively campaigning for LBJ since he ran for the Senate in 1948. And this is Lady Bird speaking on board the LBJ special, a campaign train he headlined during the 1960 election when he was the VP candidate on the ticket with JFK. So 4 years later, Lady Bird was not going to let a socially constructed gender barrier stand in her way. She was good at campaigning, and she wasn't going to stop now. Her mission was twofold: to garner votes for LBJ's reelection and to help ease the animosity in the South. And to fulfill this mission, like the LBJ special had done, she would use the time-honored campaign method of a whistle stop. Traveling by train was efficient. More ground could be covered and time saved by making brief stops in towns along the tracks, and speakers would address the crowd from a rear car with a platform and a podium. And in a matter of weeks, Lady Bird and her team pulled off an impressive feat, outfitting a custom 19-car train called the Lady Bird Special. And this parlor observation car was rescued from a junk heap in Pennsylvania, and it was turned into an eye-catching caboose that served as the hospitality car. An architect designed the back platform where the speeches would take place. The White House upholsterer refurbished the inside lounge seating, and the calligrapher hand-lettered a white drumhead with the train's name. Everything was designed down to the last detail, from thousands of pieces of campaign swag to a menu featuring Southern dishes and favorites served at the Johnson Ranch in Texas. Passengers could dine on dishes like the LBJ steak platter, which could be ordered raring to go, middle of the road, or all the way. Press cars were set up so that the journalists riding along could cover events and file stories right from the train. An advance team was sent out to prepare for the train's arrival in every single town down the line. And more than 1,000 short-term guests were invited to ride the train. And here are some of those guests in a reception lounge, and they're being greeted by some of the 15 women who were the official hostesses on the train. When the White House released the news about the Lady Bird special, it made headlines and it would be talked about through the November election and beyond, said one prominent political columnist. Mrs. Lyndon B. Johnson's train sortie through the South will be incomparably the most important campaign effort undertaken by the wife of an American president. After the whistle stop made the news, an informant reported to the FBI a bomb threat against the train in Mississippi. And the Secret Service forbade President Johnson from making a trip like this through the South. They thought that long stretches of railroad track, nearly 2,000 miles of track, would be challenging to protect, and the shadow of JFK's assassination was still looming over the nation. The Secret Service did implement tight security measures for the Lady Bird special, including having an extra engine precede the train by 15 minutes in case the tracks were bombed. Lady Bird was undeterred by the prospect of danger. On the morning of October 6th, she, President Johnson, who rode along to the first stop, and their eldest daughter, Linda, boarded the campaign train in Washington, D.C., along with 300 other passengers. And in just 4 days, the Lady Bird special would cross through 8 states, make 47 stops, and cover 1,682 miles as it made way for New Orleans. And the campaign train got off to an auspicious start in Alexandria, Virginia. There was a carnival-like atmosphere as some 8,000 people greeted the train, cheering loudly and waving flags and banners. And Lady Bird got right to it. She addressed head-on the backlash toward her husband. She pointed out that the Civil Rights Act was passed with bipartisan support, and she stressed the need for the nation to come together, saying, "We must search for the ties that bind us, not settle for the tensions that divide us." And what Lady Bird said here in Alexandria was widely covered in the media, which greatly expanded the reach of the message that she delivered. And you can see in this photo that LBJ is in the background. And this was Lady Bird's show, and he was happy for her to be in the spotlight. And when it was his turn to speak, he began by lauding Lady Bird.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, Alexandria has been chosen as the first stop by one of the greatest campaigners in America. And I'm proud to announce and I'm very proud to announce that I am her husband.
I must say, I love that clip, and I never, ever get tired of hearing it. And after the festivities finished in Alexandria, the president returned to the White House, and the Lady Bird special continued down the tracks. Throughout Virginia and North Carolina, thousands of people turned out at each stop, enthusiastic crowds that were larger than expected given the political climate, and drawing as many men as women, which showed the wide-ranging interest in this trip. Lady Bird talked about the importance of education and the greater economic prosperity that occurred during Democratic administrations. She advised audiences to march forward with the times and end racial animosity. And she repeated the message at the heart of the trip, that to her and the president, the South was a beloved and valued part of the country. At each stop, there was always a smattering of Goldwater supporters, and they made their presence known with signs and banners, but for the most part, they were low-key and largely respectful. The crowds were also integrated to varying degrees. And in Norfolk, a local newspaper noted that the city's progressiveness was on display that day. At an off-train rally, Black civic leaders shared the speaker's platform with the highest-ranking politicians in the state, the governor and the lieutenant governor. When Lady Bird's press secretary, Liz Carpenter, visited Raleigh while scouting the route, she ran up against the reluctant Democratic candidate for governor. He was afraid that he would lose votes to his Republican opponent if he were seen cozying up to President Johnson. His staff told Liz Carpenter that if the Lady Bird special came to town, they would arrange an event befitting a lady, perhaps a tea with pedophores. Liz said, "I seethed as I listened to this kind of outmoded thinking." Instead of a dainty lady's tea, Lady Bird and LBJ, who flew into Raleigh to meet the train, they teamed up for the largest political rally in the city's history. After rolling into South Carolina, the Lady Bird special encountered its first serious signs of trouble, said Liz Carpenter. "It was so surprisingly ugly, it left all of us aghast." In Columbia, the state capital, a friendly audience of some 8,000 people greeted the train. But a group of Goldwater supporters was there, and they were intent on being disruptive. And to make up for their small number, there were about 25 of them. They surged the speaker's platform, heckling, taunting, and waving placards with derogatory signs like "Lady Bird, go home to your roost," and worse. While talking about the nuclear test ban treaty LBJ had recently signed, Lady Bird paused, held up her right hand, and she directly addressed the hecklers.
Yet, when the test ban treaty was signed exactly a year ago today, no one rejoiced more than this same Lyndon Johnson, who had sat for so many years My friends, this is a country of many viewpoints, and I respect your right to express your own. Now it's my turn to express mine. Thank you.
Lady Bird finished her speech without further disruption, and she later recalled being rather proud of the way I'd handled it. I was mad and cool. In Goldwater Steep, Charleston, more than 200 local volunteers aided the White House advance team in organizing for the Lady Bird special, and they did so despite knowing they would almost certainly face retaliation. One local supporter, Frida Bernstein, had no qualms about aligning with the Lady Bird special. She affixed an LBJ for the USA poster and a sign promoting the rally to her car, and she drove around the Charleston area. And along for the ride were Snoopy and Dixie, who did their parts by wearing signs, one of which read, "I like her," and the other, "I like him," in reference to the Johnson family beagles. And they're on the right wearing their own campaign swag. Two things in Charleston illustrated the power of the Lady Bird special. Attendance at an off-train rally reached 12,000, 3 times the number local Democratic leaders were hoping for. The other was that, even here in contentious Goldwater country, the Lady Bird special scored a political victory. The support of popular local Congressman Mendel Rivers. He's seen here on the right touring Charleston's historic district with Lady Bird the next morning. Rivers spoke at the rally, and he was supporting a Democratic presidential ticket for the first time in 2 decades. A reporter asked Lady Bird about the Hecklers who followed the train. Some of them followed the train from Columbia to Charleston, and they were even more disruptive there. And Lady Bird replied, "You've got to look at all this in its proper perspective. Think of the thousands and thousands who have come out to see us and given us so much warmth, such fine welcome. Think of the dozens, just dozens, that's all, who have done the heckling." The Lady Bird special continued through Georgia, drawing sizable audiences, even in places where there was pure hate for the president. Lady Bird remained gracious and upbeat, and at every stop, she continued to press her points, like reminding audiences that the state's per capita income had gone up during Democratic years. Always on her husband's mind, she said, is trying to figure out practical, compassionate ways to help those in America that are still in need. In Florida, too, the Lady Bird special continued to draw surprisingly large crowds in a state described as politically doubtful for Democrats. The Lady Bird special's entrance into Pensacola was even more dramatic than usual. When the train reached a bridge spanning a bay leading into the city, an armed Coast Guard vessel was waiting to escort it across. And the reason for the amped up security was because the county sheriff's department had received an anonymous phone call the day before reporting that an attempt would be made to blow up a bridge while the Lady Bird special was crossing. And this photo shows the train pulling into Pensacola, and you can see how close it got to the tracks and why the train would slow to a crawl as it came into towns. In Alabama, the Lady Bird special's popularity was too great for Governor Wallace to ignore. Although he fled the state before the train arrived, he telegrammed a greeting to Lady Bird and sent 4 dozen roses bearing the message "Welcome home" that were presented to her on the speaker's platform. Lady Bird had deep family ties to Alabama. She called this stretch of the trip the land of cousins, and it was also, as she said, the state most adamantly against us. But ultimately, adulation won out over animosity, and Lady Bird was welcomed by a 20,000 strong cheering crowd in Mobile, the largest of the trips so far. Surprisingly, opposition in Biloxi, the only stop in Mississippi, was fairly sedate considering it was the nation's most segregated state. At the time, it was reported that anti-President Johnson sentiment in Mississippi was stronger even than anti-Black sentiment. And yet, even here, some 9,000 people turned out for the Lady Bird special, and the state's staunchly segregationist governor got on board the train. There was Mardi Gras level fanfare as the Lady Bird special pulled into its last stop in New Orleans. And Katharine Graham, publisher of the Washington Post, was there when the train arrived. It was a hot and steamy night, and we all watched the president greet Lady Bird with a big hug and kiss, said Graham. It was very clear to me what a team they were. Lady Bird and the president's message of unity was evident in New Orleans. In some areas, the 25,000 person crowd was mostly Black, and in other areas, it was mostly white. except in front of the speaker's platform where, and this was noted because it was a significant detail, the races were packed together with no rhyme or reason. At various times during the trip, Lady Bird was described as trading lace mitts for iron gloves, and she did so now. She told the audience, "What is afoot in this coming election is not really a contest between two political parties. We are testing as a nation whether we shall move forward with understanding of each other or backward toward a national climate of fear and dislike. This is, I believe, a contest between the positive and the negative, between the yes and the no." Next, just as Lady Bird had done, LBJ cut to the heart of the matter, telling the audience, "We are going to have a government of all the people, and your president is going to protect the constitutional rights of every American." Recalled Liz Carpenter, the audience went wild, black and white alike. LBJ then addressed Democratic donors at a separate event, and he gave what was lauded as the most moving speech of the campaign and the toughest speech of his career on civil rights. The Lady Bird special was widely deemed a success by political strategists and the press, and it was called a virtuoso political performance. It helped Lyndon Johnson achieve the landslide victory he hoped for. He carried 44 states, including Virginia and North Carolina, and he garnered 61.1% of the popular vote, a record that still stands. A West Wing memo stated that only a miracle could deliver Florida for President Johnson, and that miracle seems to have been the Lady Bird special because Florida went for LBJ. After wrapping up the whistle stop in New Orleans, Lady Bird and LBJ headed to their Texas ranch for a brief rest before they did some more campaigning. And Liz Carpenter, who traveled with them, recalled that LBJ was bursting with pride. She said he had watched his wife take on an assignment that no other woman had done in history and perform it with skill and with heart and with courage in the ugly hours. LBJ laughed, shook his head, and said, "Now, Liz, that's the way to run a railroad." So thank you all so much for listening, and I am going to transfer back to Mina for some Q&A.
Wow, thank you so much. That was really just fascinating. You know, you hear about first ladies and how smart they are and how courageous they are and how dedicated they are to their husbands. But this just sounds like an incredible story of all of that.
It really was. And there are just so many things that this campaign train highlights. And I think one of them is the incredibly progressive partnership that LBJ and Lady Bird had. And he was very, you saw it in the photos in Alexandria and New Orleans. He's in the background. He had his time at the podium as well, but she was right there, and he believed in her. And they really did have this incredible partnership. Mm-hmm. And I also love that he gave her credit. He told a reporter in 1960, "She has made my career possible."
Oh, that's amazing. Because you think presidents, if you get to the point of president, you are pretty self-absorbed. But, and we've been doing these programs with Heather Rogers on the presidential, the different presidents. And we've only done 3, but 2 of them were really, really involved with it. Their wives were very, very involved. Do you know, was Lady Bird Johnson, was she always as much of a partner to him as, throughout his career?
Yeah, so certainly by 1964, she was his most important personal and political advisor. Always personally, she didn't always campaign. That really changed. He first ran for the U.S. House of Representatives in 1937. Lady Bird she went toe-to-toe with her father to get a $10,000 advance on her inheritance to stake his campaign. After she put up the money, she largely stayed in the background, which was the custom of the day. She said something like, "I packed the bag and washed the socks and reminded him to eat." Occasionally, she might go along and say howdy to the voters. But that really changed in 1948 when he was in a hotly contested primary runoff for the Senate, and she swung into action, and she she was called an able vote getter by a newspaper. And so that's when she really began campaigning for him, and their partnership became much more visible.
Hmm. And was the whistle stop train her idea, or how did that come about?
So in 1960, with the LBJ special, Lady Bird, we saw, was on board. Liz Carpenter, who was Lady Bird's press secretary, and also the first East Wing staff director. But that all happened when Lady Bird became First Lady, but she was working for LBJ and Lady Bird before that. And so they were all involved in the LBJ special. So they had this history of that to draw on. And so I'm not sure exactly whose idea it was. I think maybe Liz Carpenter was really the driver behind that. She was tasked with coming up with a way for them to campaign into the South. So, but they were all involved in that, and they amped everything up. Everything this time versus the LBJ special in 1960, everything about the Lady Bird special was designed to get press, to get notice, to get people to turn out for the campaign train, from the Southern menu to Lady Bird's wardrobe to her experience in politics. Everything was fodder for the press, and to gain as much recognition for this as possible. And I do think it would have been really hard for people not to have known what Lady Bird was doing at the time. I think in person along the way, she addressed about 500,000 people. 225 reporters rode the train, either the whole way or rotated on and off at their stops. And so people like Helen Thomas, legendary correspondent Helen Thomas, she rode the train the entire way. So we have stories going out over the national wire. It's covered in local publications all along the train. And all three of the major networks had camera crews on the train as well. So it also would have been on TV every night.
Hmm. What about the risk, not just the physical risk of them, but like the political risk of having a woman going out and doing this thing that hadn't been done before at such a politically harsh time, I'll say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, they certainly risked backlash. Like if nobody turned out for the campaign train, right, that would have been the story. And instead, we see people turning out for Lady Bird, even in places like Mobile with 20,000 people. And so I really think that people responded to her sincerity. Her She was the perfect person to do this because she was from the South. She loved the South. She is genuine about that. And one of the interesting things to me is that, of course, some misogyny reared up in response to this, which was also one of the risks, but not a lot, not as much as we might have thought, given that she's breaking tradition here. And a lot of the male veteran political journalists saw they didn't express any misogyny, or if they had any, they set it aside to see the political nature of what was going on. There were some editors at a Charleston newspaper who had this very misogynistic editorial before the Lady Bird special came into town. And they remembered fondly the ladylike attitude of Bess Truman, who, even though Harry Truman was fighting for his political life in 1948, she didn't campaign for him.
Mhm.
But those instances were it surprised me that they were actually kind of rare.
Mhm. There was still a lot of, I mean, out of maybe respect for the office at that point, maybe too. Like there was, it seems like that's changed, but maybe that had a little bit of part of it. I'm just going to get into some of the questions from the audience because I could go on all day.
Me
um,
too.
Several people have said how amazing she is, and she was a blessing to see. And this is somebody says this is a Democratic Party I grew up with, and I miss the youth exalting our country's leaders. Big change from today. Um, Thomas asked, did she have any input or comment about the Counting Daisies ad? Another arguably major push for the LBJ campaign.
Yeah, I don't know specifically if she had any input on the Counting Daisies ad. Um, Certainly as she went along on the train campaign. I mentioned some of the points that she talked about, but she also talked about peace. And Barry Goldwater was not considered somebody that anybody wanted with their hands on the button.
Hmm. Do you think that Democrats could do something like this again? And if so, would it work considering today's political climate?
Yeah, that's interesting. So I think whistle stops kind of went out of fashion, right, with airplanes and things like that. And they actually had a hard time finding the caboose for the Lady Bird special because these parlor observation cars just weren't really around anymore. Um, I I I actually think that if somebody did take a train campaign, that it would be kind of brilliant, and you probably would get to these towns where people felt like they weren't often seen. There was a town, the first town over the North Carolina line called Ahoskie. They telegrammed the White House and said, please stop here. Nobody has come here since Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, and no passengers train has stopped in 12 years. So, they got out. And LBJ, who was considered a masterful campaigner, he said, stop there. If they want you that bad, you'll get people out from 3 counties. And sure enough, they got 10,000 people in Ahoskie, which was more than double the town's population. So I actually think it would be a brilliant strategy if somebody did something like this again.
I'm gonna campaign for it.
I'll ride
Okay.
along. I volunteer.
So Judy asks, what happened to the Lady Bird special train? Is it in the LBJ's museum? I'm sorry, I'm all the letters. Is it
Um,
in Johnson's museum?
No, unfortunately, the Ladybird special is no more. Because all those cars would have been owned by the railroad companies, and so they took their cars back. I think for a while, the end car, the caboose, was made into a diner for a little while, but then eventually that was even scrap heaped. I know it's sad.
I do love a good diner, so that is sad. um, do we know anything about her relationship with Jacqueline Kennedy?
Yeah, I mean they had a nice cordial relationship, and actually they Jackie's staff said how valuable Ladybird was to them because she would often stand in for Jackie, who had less of an inclination for politics. So Ladybird was very visible as a second lady. She would stand in sometimes for Jackie Kennedy. She would stand in for LBJ. And on occasion, she even stood in for the president, President Kennedy. So she was very visible. And, people would ask stuff of Lady Bird or comment when she became First Lady. Oh, poor you. You have to follow Jackie Kennedy. She was so like sophisticated and whatever. And Lady Bird said, please don't feel sorry for me. She said, I still have my Lyndon.
Oh, that's
Yeah, it was kind
harsh.
of endearing.
That's rough. Um, did Lady Bird write her own speeches?
So Lady Bird, for the Lady Bird special in particular, since more than 40 speeches had to be written, a team of 6 women actually helped her craft all those speeches. She met with them. She told them what she wanted to say. Lady Bird also, one of the newspaper headlines said, Lady Bird demonstrates she did her homework. Lady Bird was very big on doing homework and being prepared. For state dinners, she would have a factoid about each person who came through the receiving line so she could make a personal connection. For the Lady Bird specials, she got materials from the staff at National Geographic. She got books from the library. She talked to the Congress people and their wives, the states she would be going through. So she was very well prepared and involved. And like Liz Carpenter said, she never said anything that wasn't her own belief. And that's why I really think that this sincerity resonated with people. She didn't hide behind canned political talking points.
Hmm. Do you know what the entire cost of the Lady Bird special trip was? Did the press pick up on the cost along with the others and complain about it?
I don't recall much complaining. I don't know what the overall total was, but it was paid for by the Democratic National Committee. And then people would pay for their own food in the dining car as if it were, a restaurant. Um, and the reporters had to pay their own fare. So they would actually have to buy a train ticket to ride the train. So there were other offset costs, but yeah, it was paid for by the Democratic National Committee.
It seems like, now everybody picks apart every little cent people pay, spend for these kind of things. So it's an interesting question. Could first ladies' parlor politics from the Revolution all the way to Lady Bird make a comeback?
I'm sorry, parlay politics.
First ladies'
I'm
politics.
sorry, parlor politics. Um, yeah, I mean, I, I don't know. I mean, I don't see why they couldn't. I guess if a first lady decided that she wanted to, say, emulate Lady Bird and make her role model, um, I think that Eleanor certainly expanded the role. Before Eleanor, first ladies were, as one of her biographers put it, they were supposed to be part of the furniture. They were supposed to stay close to the White House, oversee teas, and they weren't supposed to take an active part in public life, which, as we know, was not going to work for Eleanor Roosevelt. Lady Bird Johnson comes along, and she was the first lady to professionalize the role. So she hired Liz Carpenter, the first East Wing staff director. She hired a team to work on her projects. And she really developed this great relationship with the media to get out her messaging rather than being adversarial with them. And so I think the two of them certainly expanded it and gave first ladies who came after them a choice about how they might want to approach the role.
Hmm. Did This is my question. Do you think that the Kamala Harris, I'm speaking, during her rallies, does it come from Lady Bird Johnson, where she said, we're all allowed our opinion, but right now I'm speaking.
Oh gosh, that's very interesting. I don't know, but it does, but when you say it, it does sound like exactly what Lady Bird said to those hecklers in Columbia. Ooh, I like
Hmm.
to think that whether she intended that or not, the connection is certainly there.
Hmm. Yeah, as soon as you played the clip, I was like, oh, that sounds so
Mhm.
familiar. Where did I hear from? That was that. I mean, I don't know if it went over I mean, it sounded like the hecklers kind of stopped for Lady Bird Johnson. I'm not sure as if it was as effective, for Kamala Harris, but times are different as well. Um, when the Johnson daughters traveled with Lady Bird Johnson, would they speak to the crowds also?
Yes. So young people turned out all along the route of the Lady Bird special, from grade schoolers to college students. And 20-year-old Linda rode along for the first half of the journey, 17-year-old Lucy for the second 2 days. And they were both enormously popular with the crowds, and they addressed audiences, they faced down hecklers. And in fact, the title of the book comes from something that Linda said at one of the stops in High Point, North Carolina. The train was leaving a station and some boys ran after it waving Goldwater signs. And Linda flipped on the loudspeaker and she cheerfully reproached them. And she said, "You're running after the 20th century. You can't catch us." And that ultimately became the title of the book because it embodies the forward momentum of the campaign train, but also the surrounding social progress and women's rights and civil rights that was taking place at the time.
Hmm. Madeline says, I was a child at this time and was from Massachusetts. Do you think that the recent memory of the public suffering of Jackie Kennedy when JFK was killed contributed to the public's acceptance of Lady Bird Johnson, even in the South? I recall that we worried for her safety and wanted her to be safe.
Mhm. Yeah, I think possibly. I mean, and it's a really good thing to remember the really tragic circumstances that brought LBJ and Lady Bird to the White House. And Lady Bird said something like she felt like she was suddenly on stage for a part she never rehearsed.
Hmm.
And she, just like LBJ assured the American people on the night he became president, she vowed, "I will do my best." And I do think that she was a unifier. And again, her going through the South, um, she was the best and maybe the only person at that time who could have done this. And there was all this concern about her safety. And a White House employee said that he said, "Oh, I don't think people realized at the time exactly how nervous the Secret Service was about her taking this trip. But I think that Lady Bird ultimately believed that no harm would come to her in the South, this place that she loved and called home."
Hmm. I want to dig into a little bit about, this was a real opportunity for women to shine, not just Lady Bird, but you said that she had women writers for her speeches. She had 15 women that were the sort of like stewardesses and on the train. How did that all come about? Like, how did she design it in such a way?
Well, I think this might surprise people that LBJ was a huge proponent of advancing women in government, and he and Lady Bird both, at Lady Bird's instigation, at Liz Carpenter's instigation, and they both loved can do men, but also can do women.
Mhm.
And that was another newsworthy thing about this train, is it was run by women, which had also never happened before in politics. And as Liz Carpenter said, men were an important part of the endeavor, but the women were calling the signals. And something else that was new was advanced men who would go into these towns and drum up crowds, for talk to local politicians before the president or whoever came to town. Advanced men were fixtures on the campaign trail, but the Lady Bird Special had women on their advance teams, and they would go to these towns a week ahead of time and work with local communities. And even having women do this was new and newsworthy. And the other thing about women, I do think that the Lady Bird Special is an astonishing snapshot at this moment in time for all of the trailblazing women that it brought together on that train, from Lady Bird and her team to all the women journalists.
Mhm.
And I delve into some of their stories too, because each one of them had to overcome gender barriers to be in her position. I mentioned there was Helen Thomas. There was another reporter named Gloria Negri who worked for the Boston Globe. And she got her big break one slow Saturday in the newsroom because word of a murder came in. And the male editors look around and they're all like, "Well, what are we supposed to do?" Because the only reporter available was Gloria. And they didn't think that they could possibly subject a woman to the horrors of a grisly crime scene. And Gloria said, "Send me." And she got the story.
Excellent. I love women of courage and chutzpah. Okay, okay, so did Robert Caro cover the Lady Bird Special in his multi-volume LBJ bio?
I can't recall off the top of my head if he mentions it at all. Um, I don't think he would, if he did mention it, that it wasn't in any kind of great detail from what I'm remembering here on the spot.
Okay. LBJ was under investigation, was going to be charged when JFK was killed. History is not a fun subject at times. I don't really know too much about that, but I wondered if you wanted to comment on it.
I mean, I've heard that before, and I mean, my sense is that no, LBJ did not orchestrate JFK's assassination, and also, they Lady Bird. This happened in LBJ and Lady Bird's home state. They were in the motorcade, and just everything that I've read about what they said and all the things that no, I mean, I don't think so.
Okay. So I was going to ask you this as well, and several people have said, like, what was her childhood like? Can you share any information about Lady Bird's life before she got married? How did she develop such an engaging, genuine, and wise attitude that helped her relate to widely different audiences?
Yeah, so she had a bit of a sad childhood. She grew up in East Texas, and her father, was a well-to-do family, but her mother died when she was 5.
Hmm.
And that's how she came to spend all of these summers with relatives in Alabama. I said during my talk that through Alabama, she called it the land of cousins. And at all these stops, like she would call out to cousins in the crowd. They were going to an off-train rally in Mobile. and she had a couple in the car with her, and then they saw a couple more on the street, and they're like, "Stop the car!" And then those cousins came along. So she has fond memories of spending summers with her relatives in Alabama, and she was always going to be going places. So Lady Bird had, before she even met LBJ, she had degrees in journalism and history from the University of Texas at Austin. She also got a teaching certificate and she learned shorthand. And she was applying for teaching jobs in Australia and Hawaii, or I'm sorry, Alaska and Hawaii, because those were two exotic places where she thought she might go and teach and work. Then she met LBJ, and the rest is kind of history. But yeah, she was always, and so she always had this independent streak of her own.
Hmm. Um, we have a couple comments that I want to relate to this conversation because she did this train ride, train campaign as a campaign for her husband to support him and to support the recent legislation around the Civil Rights Act. But what were her own interests? Like there was a mention of a garden and her environmental work and things like that. So were those like her own passions, or were they something that that she shared with LBJ?
I'm not really sure if they shared the same passion for the beautification. I do know that he was very um, he really wanted to pass that legislation, and they probably worked on it. My avenue of research didn't take me down that path. That's a bit after the time period that I spent the bulk of my time researching. I do know that some ladies on the train, they did talk about gardening. There were some women in Georgia, and they talked later about how they talked with Lady Bird about flowers.
Hmm. Did you get to view Lady Bird's audio diary?
Yeah, so the really neat thing is, and if people are interested, a lot of Lady Bird's speeches were recorded, and the LBJ Library has put them on YouTube. They also have a lot of other materials digitized and online that people can access, and some of those materials are her audio diaries,
Hmm.
which were really neat. And so, yeah, I listened to a lot of those.
Hmm. Libraries, you know.
I could not write the books that I do, The First Lady of World War II, or You Can't Catch Us, without archivists and librarians.
Hmm.
So you deserve a huge shout out.
Thanks. I'll take it. Um, did Lady Bird's other family own a radio station?
Well, that was actually Lady Bird. So, in addition to helping LBJ with his career, she bought a rundown radio station in Austin, and she transformed that into a media conglomerate. And one of the things that I think is really neat about Lady Bird is that as she's whistle stopping down the tracks, she is a role model to women and girls at a time when these role models were lacking. So Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique had been published the year before in 1963, upending this predominant belief that women's fulfillment came solely from domesticity.
Hmm.
And then here comes Lady Bird whistle stopping down the tracks. And Lady Bird, she proudly identified herself as a wife, mother, businesswoman, and politician. And she considered being First Lady a daily working job. And Margaret Mead, she was a columnist for Redbook at the time, and she said something like, Mrs. Johnson is a role model for what women can do and be in the mid 20th century.
Hmm. Actually, I had a question about that when we were talking earlier about the women that were on this train.
Mhm.
Is I wondered if because women had just recently historically gotten the vote and things like that, and Black women had just gotten the vote, if they were more enthusiastic about seeing her than we could have imagined because they hadn't seen this before and they wanted and then they brought their men out too because they were like, hey, you have to check this out, because women do have a lot of like human nature is human nature, and then women do have a lot of say in their households.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think the fact that reporters noted that as many men were coming out to these rallies as women, because A lot of First Lady news would have been relegated to the women's pages in newspapers, but coverage of the Lady Bird special, it was on the front page, it was in political columns. So it really did broaden beyond, that, finite of, oh, this is women's coverage. And Lady Bird had actually been out there all year before she went out on the campaign train. And one of the things that she made news for was she gave a commencement speech at Radcliffe, a women's college, and it was called the best commencement speech of the season. And she told the graduating women that they were pioneers of a new age and that ultimately determining their life, they could, I'm totally paraphrasing here, but they could, they need not be afraid that their intellect was a threat to their femininity, that they could have both.
Mhm.
And that they could happily marry man and job or man and career or happily marry one of them. And these were very progressive words at the time. And a newspaper headline said, Radcliffe seniors hear Lady Bird describe the modern US woman.
Mhm. So, do you think that she was instrumental in like making that change in society at the time because she was so progressive and so verbal about it?
I think so. I think that she had this extraordinary ability. Like she was bridging the divide between the traditional and the progressive. And I think that really made her successful in that regard. And I do think it's so hard to imagine exactly how impactful this was, but it really was. And to see their first lady, the country had never seen this before. Their first lady whistle stopping down the tracks. She's confident, she's capable, she's courageous, she's compassionate, she's all of these things, and people responded.
Hmm. So she really put a face to somebody who wasn't, like this, kind of, this is not the right word, but submissive, sort of like, not just, but like housewife versus like the strident,
Mhm.
bloomer wearing, whatever, she was really like able to bridge that divide.
Mhm. Yeah, she was. And I love the comment that one of the reporters had that she during the Lady Bird special would trade lace mitts for iron gloves. So she really, yeah, I mean, and she drove home those points. But yes, to your point, she wrapped it in this softer sell, while still getting her points across.
Mhm. And somebody asked earlier, why this story isn't better known. You and I were talking about this a little bit before we started. Is did it feel like it had been lost to history to you when you kind of dug it up, or what do you think happened with this story?
I mean, it did feel lost to history. I know that two of Lady Bird's biographers, at least, devoted a few pages to it. I think that it was only 4 days. But as
Hmm.
Lady Bird said, it was like doing a month's worth of work in 4 days. And it is a good way to capture the surround that was happening. But I think this also happened with the story of Eleanor Roosevelt's trip to the South Pacific, that they get overshadowed and lost within the larger scope of these women's lives.
Hmm.
And I think that's what happened in both instances.
Hmm.
And I don't know, lucky for me. And Eleanor said about her Pacific trip, she said, the Pacific trip left a mark from which I think I shall never be free, just because of everything emotional and physical, but really the emotional toll that trip took on her and seeing so many wounded servicemen. And Lady Bird said about the Lady Bird special, she said it was the four most dramatic days in her political life. So these trips were both very impactful on both women, but again, I think overshadowed within the larger scope.
Hmm. And I had mentioned earlier that we do these programs about presidents with Heather Rogers, and you know, talking about Jane Addams, or now we're talking about Eleanor Roosevelt. Why was Lady Bird's so successful in having women wanting to emulate her, even after all these other women had been presidential wives had sort of been very active in supporting their husbands.
Um, no, I mean, one of the things that struck me, and I think that Lady Bird fostered was this sense of camaraderie among the women on the Lady Bird special. And Lady Bird and Liz Carpenter, very different personalities, but they were personal and professional friends for 2 decades. And I think that she was a very genuine and sincere person, Lady Bird. She was smart. And, it was a lot about how can we come together to get this done?
Mhm.
And, maybe that's one of the things that later people looking to her might have um, been impressed by or take something away from that. Because one of the things that I've really been thinking about is the power in the collective, that when we come together, that we can make change, we can achieve a historic undertaking. And that's what Lady Bird and her team of women did by working together.
Yeah. I think, and Catherine says this too, that they were much longer than 2 decades. They remain friends to the end of their lives. Is that
Yeah, well, what I meant was in 1964 when Liz Carpenter became Lady Bird. Liz Carpenter went to Lady Bird and she said, because she'd been working for LBJ as VP in the White House, and she went to Lady Bird and said, I want to work with you. And she said, I want to be your press secretary. And no professional news person had ever been a first lady's press secretary. And Lady Bird said, great. And I also want you to be my staff director. So at that point in 1964, they had this 20-year personal and professional friendship behind them.
to me, like that's also very powerful to show that women can be supportive of each other professionally and as
Mhm,
friends. You
mhm,
know, they there's so many stereotypes about women, like the hen parties and things like that. But yet they were able to accomplish something so powerful together and stay
mhm,
friends.
mhm, mhm.
Like,
Well, you know what? I'm very happy, to hear. I think that's amazing. And that they did stay friends to the end of their lives. I mean, it really does speak to that connection that they had.
mhm. And we just have a couple more minutes. This has been so fascinating, but I definitely want to know what you're working on next because you mentioned it earlier, like before we started, and I was like, oh my God, I have got to read that book as soon as it comes out.
Well, I'm going to pivot away from first ladies for a little bit. I'm going to be writing about Eve Curie, who's the daughter of Marie Curie, and she was a leading voice to the Allied nations during World War II. And again, a very well known at the time, but kind of been forgotten. But she did know Eleanor Roosevelt. They were friends, and she was at the White House with Eleanor and FDR. So I've decided that I can't write a book unless it has an Eleanor Roosevelt connection.
It makes sense since you've already done the research, but what is it about Eve Curie that captured your attention?
What captured my attention was how devoted she was to the Allied cause, and she paid a price for it. So when France fell to the Nazis, she had to leave. She was later stripped of all of her property, all of her possessions by Vichy France. She was in London during the Blitz. She did a battlefront tour to battlefronts in Asia and Africa, and she was the first woman to go as a correspondent to a lot of those places. So really, another one of these really strong women, and like Eleanor Roosevelt, stepped up during World War II. The same way that Eleanor was a leading voice on the home front and to the world, Eve Curie was as well.
That's really interesting because we had talked about why this story wasn't so well known about the whistle stop train, and we were thinking maybe it's overshadowed a little bit by the fact that her husband was president, and Eve Curie's maybe a little bit overshadowed by the fact that her mother was so well known.
Yes. Well, and the reason that Eve is mostly remembered as her mother's biographer, and that is what gave her the platform. So that her biography of her mom was published in 1937, became world famous. Eve starts lecturing and speaking, and that's why when war started,
Mm.
that when World War II started, that she already had the platform to now use it for the Allied cause.
Hmm. Like I said, as soon as it comes out, we are reading it. Like everybody in the library, we're
Well,
all
thank
reading.
you. Thank you.
I do
It's
know
going to
you
take
said
me a little while.
yes, it's gonna. I think you had said it was coming out in 2029, but that's
Yes.
because the research is
Yes.
probably like intense. Um, Thank you, Shannon, so much. This hour has flown by, and I've just learned so much, and I have so much respect, so much more respect for Lady Bird Johnson than I ever had before. And for you for like amazing storytelling.
Well, thank you so much. I've had the best time. I could go on all night, but
I know. We will let you, head out and as Shannon says, maybe grab a green beer for tomorrow. Um, so for everybody who's been here, thank you so much. Remember, you can read Shannon's book, and you can get it from the library, or you can buy a signed book from Aesop's Fable. I'll send out a link to that. And I hope you have a wonderful evening, everyone.
yes, thank you. Good night.
Good night, Shannon.